The events that are part of Beethoven in a new medium are trying to emphasize the different technological forms, media forms, and actors who've carried Beethoven's music and his legacy through the 19th century to our day. And it might seem that the string quartet is a pretty self-evident mediator, one that people who are interested in classical music nowadays recognize. But actually, by the 1820s, the string quartet itself had been through many different transformations and had been placed in many different media environments. The string quartet, after all, that a composer such as Mozart or Beethoven's teacher Haydn composed earlier in the 18th century, in the 1780s, say, was very much an amateur form. The place where you would perform it would be at home in a room like this one, perhaps with three of your better musician friends, and you might busk through a few movements of a string quartet at a party, or perhaps to make the long winter evenings fly by. You know, by the time that Beethoven is composing the Razumovsky string quartets in the early 19th century, it's a really very different beast altogether. And the idea that you would be able to simply go out and buy the parts from a music seller, or perhaps get copies made from a friend of yours who had the parts and then just play through them with your friends, was unlikely. And already Beethoven's teacher Haydn had taken the string quartet to London, where suddenly it had been taken out of the domain of the home and placed in ones that looked much more like the public concert. His great friend and supporter Johann Salomon and his colleagues played a lot of Haydn string quartets in some of the world's first public ticketed concerts, which is effectively like taking some domestic entertainment, a television show, say, and putting on the grand public stage, say, taking that television show and playing it in the cinema. Now, by the time Beethoven was composing the late string quartets, something else had happened, which is that the string quartet, as not just a genre, but a group of people, perhaps a group of professionals whose job was to play string quartets, had more or less come into being. Already in the early 19th century, this had been a trend that Beethoven benefited from. His Razumovsky string quartets would have been unthinkable without the great Chopin-Sig, his great rotund violinist, virtuoso friend and colleague, and his colleagues in the Chopin-Sig quartet. By the 1820s, Beethoven was famous enough that there were a lot of virtuosos very keen to play his music. And if anyone knows the late Beethoven string quartets, composed mostly in the middle of the 1820s, they know this is music that you can't just play through at first hearing. And yet it is the kind of music that had premieres, most of which were disastrous, in fairly small rooms, but nonetheless was hotly anticipated by a generation of ardent Beethovenians who came equipped to these new kinds of domestic concert with other media tools, perhaps, that we take for granted now. And one was the miniature score. You know, a miniature score is a funny thing. It's a prayer book-sized, copy of the piece that you're not supposed to play from. Until this point, pretty much all string quartets were published in parts. In other words, if you want to know how it went, you have to play it through. A miniature score means that this is music to be contemplated, not necessarily played. And indeed, we know from contemporaries such as Sir George Smart, who traveled on a Beethoven pilgrimage to see his great hero in Vienna and ask him about things like metronome markings, that people did indeed sit around in silence during string quartet concerts in the 1820s and contemplate this tremendously difficult, tremendously hard music using these technologies, which were pretty new, such as the miniature score. This is music, after all, that, quite unlike the string quartets of, say, the 1780s by Haydn and Mozart, you're not supposed to like on first hearing. It's, in a way, a species of modernism. And what do modernists like? They like music that's hard to like. They like music that is, as we say nowadays about difficult rock songs, growers, things that you maybe have to listen to a second time, a third time, maybe even a fourth time, before you can truly uncover what might be good about it. And then after that, if you still don't like it, it could still be your fault for not having understood the hidden beauties on offer. Now, another media form that impinges on the string quartet in this period is the review. You know, at the start of Beethoven's career, reviewing music, certainly by professional music reviewers in organs such as music journals and newspapers, was a very new pursuit, particularly in Vienna. Whereas these string quartets of the 1820s garnered really quite detailed reviews. And indeed, not only did they get reviews, but it seems as though Beethoven, in composing them, was influenced really quite extensively by reviews that he had read, both of his music and others, in some of the more august music journals that had grown up in the German-speaking world. Among them was the Allgemeine Musikalische Zeitung by the 1820s, quite a venerable journal too, which in the 18-teens had hosted some of the most extravagant, big, heavy-breathing philosophical think pieces about Beethoven's music. Among these was a widely read and reproduced piece by E.T.A. Hoffmann, the great storyteller, essayist, fairy tale writer, and Beethoven fanatic, on what he called old and new church music. And this was a statement that became tremendously important to not only German Romanticism more broadly, but German Romanticism's relationship with the past, and in particular, a musical element of German Romanticism, which was its obsession with old Catholic church music, and particularly the Catholic church music of composers such as Palestrina. Beethoven clearly read this piece, which praised a lot of his music, for not being church music, but in some sense, getting at or accessing the spirit of church music more effectively than even music that was explicitly composed with a liturgical function or a religious theme. And this is because, as E.T. Hoffmann wrote, all music, he said, was written with the object of praising the Creator to express the highest and the holiest sentiments. Now, this is exactly the kind of German Romanticism that Beethoven would have taken to heart when composing the piece that we're going to hear today, the third movement of his A minor string quartet, known as the Heiliger Dankgesang, or the Holy Song of Thanks. Its full title is The Holy Song of Thanks, from a convalescent, someone getting well from an illness, to Godhead and die Gottheit. And he very specifically said, and this is Beethoven the Antiquarian, that it is in der Lydischen Tonart, in the Lydian mode. What is the Lydian mode? Well, it's a sort of a modern understanding of old so-called church modes that Gregorian chant would have been sung in, and it's the mode in which the fourth is raised. So if you were to play F to F, all the white notes on a piano keyboard, that would be the Lydian mode. Why was Beethoven so interested in something antiquarian, something religious, perhaps religiose, in the context of a string quartet? Well, on the one hand, because he'd clearly been imbibing a lot of this romantic thought inspired by his own music in music journals, and also because he had subsequently availed himself of another media form, which is more journals and copies of older music that were made available to him, particularly in the libraries of his patrons. You know, we take for granted nowadays, I think, with our sort of new media access to everything, the music of the past is instantly accessible. For Beethoven, this was a pretty new thing, not only hearing older music, but being able to research old music. And it seems obvious that he encountered pieces of Palestrina, both in transcription in music journals that he read, but also taking his sketchbooks into the libraries of the Archduke Rudolph and others, and actually copying down sections from masses by composers such as Palestrina and others. It's this that inspired him in this quartet to compose a movement of really quite striking antiquarian atmosphere. Is it in the Lydian mode? Well, kinda. But tonally, it certainly sounds strange. The great commentator and friend or colleague of Beethoven's, Johann Friedrich Reichardt, had written about how Palestrina composes in a number of journals that Beethoven would have read. And he said that it's the kind of music that proceeds both through imitation, that is, the parts overlapping with each other, imitating each other's voices, and also as a series of what he called unconnected chords, these slow sonorities that simply succeeded one another, each one creating a different atmosphere. And that's certainly what we hear in the Heiliger Dankgesang. It's a piece of music that opens with absolutely clear, what you would call points of imitation. And you'll hear falling intervals that are replicated between the instruments to create this contrapuntal, sort of Renaissance, churchy atmosphere. And the other thing that you will hear is that at the end of these passages made of points of imitation, these long, slow-moving chords, which often succeed each other in ways that within the tonal syntax of Beethoven's own period strike us as slightly peculiar. And it's that peculiarity, that sort of eccentricity, what you might almost call a kind of historicist exoticism that Beethoven is trying to capture here, and indeed signals by telling us that this is not only a holy song of thanks, an unusual thing one would think usually to find in a string quartet, but that also it's a song of thanks sung in the Lydian mode. The middle of the movement is marked with new life or with new strength as the convalescent improves. And here we find the tonal language shift a little, but is no less antiquated and conventional. And in fact, he uses a chord progression that goes back to the 16th century. It was often called by contemporaries, particularly in the Neapolitan circles from which such chord sequences were developed and theorized, the Romanesque. It's perhaps most familiar to us today as the chord sequence that underlies those falling fourths in Pachelbel's canon. And we get this, again, different kind of antiquatedness, different kind of conventional churchiness explored in the New Life section before the piece ends with a return to its points of imitation, its Renaissance style counterpoint, and its numinous mystical conclusion. So sure, this is Beethoven in a new medium. This is me in a new medium. This is the transcription of music into outdoor spaces and back into the virtual spaces of our new musical communities via these digital interfaces. But in a sense, we're listening to music that has been through umpteen mediations before. Mediations from the home into the concert hall, back into the home, from amateurs to professionals, and music that has been taken from church spaces and repurposed for the aesthetic demands of a new romanticism in the 1820s. Hope you enjoy the performance.
you.